In 1914, the Archduke of Austria Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Serbian nationalists, setting off a chain of events in Europe leading to World War I. The Austrian government threatens war against Serbia and invades the country. Russia, being an ally of Serbia, declares war against Austria. With France and Great Britain being Russian allies, Germany declares war on France and invades Belgium. Finally, while Great Britain declares war against Germany, America chooses to stay neutral. Dying. To take a closer look at some pre-war prejudices, Maddie, on to you.
Thank you, Colette. There were actually a lot of prejudices prior to World War I, so let's take a look at the statistics. First and second generation immigrants made up 30% of the American population at the time. The U.S. had over 4.5 billion Irish Americans, most of whom hated Great Britain due to their oppressive rule of Ireland, making them turn their support to Central Powers and pro-German ideals. Meanwhile, President Wilson, of Scot-English descent, admired the British system as being a strong world power military and economic-wise. Because of this, many Americans sided with Wilson's biases and were sympathetic to France and Great Britain's democratic governments. But with these biases, tensions arose between immigrants and native-born Americans. Propaganda and violence, specifically from Central Powers like Germany, arose with anti-German stories in newspapers and magazines, portraying Germans like Kaiser Wilhelm as evil and cruel. America at the time had over 8 million German Americans who strongly sympathized with their relatives, as well as wanting to stay out of the war. This caused cultural isolation and a drift in the U.S.
Okay, so we're here with Sophia today.
Hi.
And we're just talking about some prejudices in World War I. So a lot of the prejudice came from, Irish and German immigrants, facing a lot of harassment and backlash, seen as possible threats, possible, betrayers, I suppose. However, in the streets in America, they weren't really supported by the government from fellow Americans.
Right.
And that kind of played a big role into further discrimination among a lot of marginalized and minority groups. So do you think that the government could have had any better supported these groups during this time, or do you think it was just a time of a lot going on and it was just chaos?
I think that it must have been really hard to balance these things because on the one side you want to be able to promote your own political agenda, you want to be able to further advance in the war, but also I feel like a lot of these groups were really heavily discriminated against and they were really mistreated, and I feel like even on local or community-based levels, I feel like there should have been some kind of action, not necessarily like federal bills or whatever, but I feel like there should have been some kind of support.
Some sort of support to help them. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Back to you. During the late 1800s, the roles for women remained stereotypical housewives, maintaining domestic duties and roles as mothers, wives, and caretakers. However, conventions and organizations began campaigning for women's rights to vote, like the NAWSA in 1890, founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The campaigns further strategized and grew through the early 1900s with the founding of the National Woman's Party, parades, marches, and demonstrations like picketing in front of the White House, calling attention to politicians in the U.S., like Woodrow Wilson. Through these actions were large monumental movements for women's rights at the time. World War I helped suffragists provide proof for their cause in the early right to vote. Meanwhile, people like Ida B. Wells, an African-American journalist and feminist, and W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American socialist and civil rights activist, both became early leaders of the civil rights movement. In just a bit, we will cover the role of women and African Americans during the war and how it expanded their employment opportunities and both their usages of the war to organize and create demands for civil rights, racial justice, and the 19th Amendment. Maddie, on to you.
Thank you, Colette. So we had a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments prior to the war, and then it was even more strengthened during World War I with the push of more propaganda and German horror stories of monstrosities caused by German soldiers, many real and many exaggerated. We also have the disapproval of Irish immigrants in America because many were backing Central Powers like Germany, hoping that it would defeat Great Britain, which would result in Ireland's independence. And with nearly 3 million Russian immigrants entering the U.S. in the late 1800s, Russian immigrants were being feared as communists, causing many of these immigrants to hide their own heritage and identity Meanwhile, with the government's public support of the war, propaganda through artists, writers, and movie depictions as villains, looking like Kaiser Wilhelm and being German, were made in persuasion to support the war. So as a lot of these immigrants in America were facing all this backlash and discrimination, the native-born Americans were being pushed further to have these discriminations in support of the war, all because of the government. Back to you, Colette. We're here with Declan Kavanaugh.
Hi.
Hi. So in World War I brought an abrupt end to one of the largest immigration periods in the U.S. Do you think that if America stayed uninvolved in the war, we would have seen larger progressions in immigration?
Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
To expand on why.
Yeah, do you think that this would have changed prejudices that many people face during this time period and in the future?
No. Do you want me to expand?
It'd be nice if
Okay.
you expanded a little bit.
No, because I don't think having more of the people here would necessarily change what people thought about them.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
The outbreak of World War I not only caused cultural barriers between those central-powered countries and those who sided with American allies, but it reduced a large era of mass immigration in America altogether. The prior year leading up to the war had an average per year of 1 million immigrants arriving in the U.S. Meanwhile, by 1918, as the war hits an end, an average of 110,000 people. Nativist isolation from immigrants not only caused a disconnect in the U.S. culture, but closed out the largest period in U.S. history. While 4 million, the majority of young white men, were sent off to fight, women, African Americans, and migrants were able to fill in many jobs and social positions, as well as play a part in fighting the war. While suffragists started increasingly vocalizing their need for equality, in an odd way, the First World War really helped them achieve that. When America entered World War I, employment rates for women increased and opportunities highly expanded. Jobs previously held for men, women were now able to work in construction, transportation, and war production. Because of these new roles for women in society, the NAWSA pushed even further for the right to vote and suffrage. Newspapers and magazine publishers began to show the importance of women and their effort in the war. Over 8 million women volunteered as Red Cross workers, and an estimate of 1,800 black nurses were Red Cross certified for military duty.
Can you repeat that?
Do you feel if women had waited to fight for suffrage until after World War I, because, they were constantly being told, there's a war going on, you really shouldn't be fighting for equality when there's people dying, and that was, the common view among many Americans, but these women still, persisted. They were fighting during the war with all this backlash. So do you think if they had waited to fight for suffrage and the voting right until after World War I, it would have been a longer struggle?
Yeah, I feel like it would have been a longer struggle if they waited. Because if there's a whole war going on and change is already happening, why not advocate for more change?
Beautiful. That was basically one of the strongest reasons they got the voting right. Beautiful, Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you.
And while women were unable to enlist in the war, African American men were, and like suffragists, they hoped to show their patriotism and be recognized as full citizens. Documented in 1917, over 700,000 African American men registered for military service. Though they were unallowed to participate in the Marines, they could serve in all branches of the Army except for aviation and naval duties, and they were still in segregated units in the military, serving separate tasks.
Okay, so today we're here with Miss Thomas.
Hi.
So, Ms. Thomas, I wanted to ask you, so during World War I, there was a lot of backlash from the African-American community about, military force, military power, and all of that. So the War Department finally created this 92nd and 93rd divisions, both primarily black combat units. Do you think that if these departments had not been created, or that African Americans and white Americans had stayed more united, there would have been larger progressions in just discriminatory behavior in America? Cut the video.
Now I go answer? Yeah. You're going to tell me yes when it's time? I can go now? Okay. So I think if these units had stayed within or had been created within white units, we would have seen a ton of progress at home. For a lot of Black Americans, World War I was really an opportunity. It was seen as an opportunity to increase treatment of equality and respect in America. And so while they were happy to have been given combat positions, because previously some of the tasks were more menial, trench digging and things like that, I think it was a missed opportunity by the American government to integrate and then really progress civil rights much more actively in that time.
Thank you so much, Miss Thomas.
Sure.
As said before, the war during and after greatly affected the immigration rate of people coming into America. Not only that, but the newspapers and magazines covering war propaganda widely affected first and second generation immigrants from coming from Central Power countries. The Red Scare came after the war with the question of signing the Treaty of Versailles. With the fear of communism after the mass takeover in Russia, many Americans resorted to anti-communist and anti-German beliefs promoted by the U.S. government itself. This made Americans fear radical foreigners, and the government provided new limits on immigration. The Emergency Quota Act in 1921, quote-unquote, admitted from any country annually to 3% of the number of residents from that country living in the United States as of the 1910 census, end quote, limiting the number of immigrants coming into America in Eastern and Western Europe. And in 1924, it created the Immigration Act, imposing even more limitations and just another blatant act of xenophobia, since that law meant that Asian countries not previously prevented from immigrating would no longer be admitted into the United States. Hi, we're here with Ian Spick, asking him some questions about immigration into the U.S. during World War I.
All right.
So during World War I, immigration into the U.S. actually became a lot more difficult for a lot of minority groups. This is because anytime they were turned away, they were stuck in this, sort of dilemma because they couldn't really re-enter their own nation.
Yeah.
So do you think it was, reasonable for Americans to be sending these immigrants and minority groups away during this time? So do you think, it was,
rational?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. Although in theory, it sounds bad, sending them away, but, when you're in a time of war and, you feel that, these people coming in, these immigrants could, help, make you lose the war, and you need to send them away, I would send them away too, high key, no offense to them, of course, but, in a time of war, if we're at war against, Germany and German immigrants are coming in, I'd be like, hey, no, and I'd, make sure that they did not come in,
I find that very interesting because this is the common view among many Americans. It was just a very rational fear to have. So thank you for giving us that viewpoint, Ian.
Of course. Thank you for the interview.
When the war ended, the casualty count of American soldiers was only about 116,000 out of the 4 million men originally sent. So unfortunately, we did lose 116,000, but it wasn't that much compared to the 4 million men that was sent, no offense. However, 3 million men returning weren't all necessarily returning straight to their jobs because it was difficult to generalize the amount of soldiers and their experiences during the post-war time, but thousands of soldiers came back disabled, ill, and permanently wounded, so it was really hard for them to go straight back to their factory jobs and agricultural work. This did, however, provide somewhat the same opportunities for women that they were given at the start of the war, so when the war ended, most women were able to keep their jobs, and we got the 19th Amendment, the right to vote, in 1919, from Woodrow Wilson. Unfortunately, it was not the same for returning Black soldiers struggling with the same issues, trying to find socioeconomic, well-paying jobs. They still suffered racism and violence and segregation. However, W.E.B. Du Bois saw the war as a defining moment for the future of African Americans, and many Black soldiers coming back to their small towns were actually celebrated because they were symbolized as hope for the future civil rights movement. Okay, and that concludes our video. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. Happy U.S. history.
True. Now we're gonna ask the audience.
You know, but you have to cut that part. Wait. But